So this is it, the final part of Strategic Bombing Week here on World War II TV. We have had some good views for the shows. I think people particularly enjoyed the one with James Jeffries about Operation Oyster on Tuesday. But the only one we're doing this week, which is in the Southern Hemisphere, is tonight's about B-29s bombing of Japan. And it connects in some ways with what Tony Redding talked about yesterday with the firebombing of Germany, although this is a different theater, of course, but some of the themes will coincide. Don't forget, as usual, to check out what we're doing on Patreon, share what we're doing on Twitter and social media, and so on and so forth. But right now, it remains me to introduce my guest. You may remember him from the introductory show of Iwo Jima Week. So Ian W. Toll, good evening, Ian, or afternoon, where you are. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Paul. Thank you.
So there's a lot to talk about here, and of course, for those who aren't aware, Ian is the author of the brilliant trilogy about the Pacific, and Twilight of the Gods is the third volume. And what I particularly liked about your book is you do talk about the air power aspect, which some authors about the Pacific Islands, it's all about the island hopping, which of course is very important. But the air power is another important part of the Pacific. So to start things off, the Allies take the various islands in June, July, and August of 1944. What does that enable the Americans to do with regards to bombing the Japanese empire that they hadn't been able to do before the seizing of those islands?
Right. So in those months, June, July, and August, the American forces were engaged in this Marianas campaign, which was an amphibious invasion of the southern Marianas Islands, first Saipan, then Guam, then Tinian. And those islands are directly south of Japan, between 1,500 and 1,600 miles from the south coast of Honshu. Guam is a bit south of Saipan and Tinian. And what this did was there were a number of sort of major strategic benefits. I had argue that it really was the decisive military action of the Pacific War after that point, after we had captured those islands, after the tremendous beating that the Imperial Japanese Navy took in a naval battle that occurred during the invasion of those islands, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. It was clear that Japan was going to lose the war. Any hope they had of reversing this tide of conquest that was then closing the ring around the home islands was essentially lost at that point. And the last year of the Pacific War would be fought essentially over the question of whether or not Japan would acknowledge the necessity to surrender, or whether we would have to invade the Japanese home islands and essentially do it the same way it had been done in Europe, where you actually would have to go in and root out the enemy, extirpate their military forces, and occupy their territory by force of arms. So that was really the entire last year of the Pacific War was largely over that question of whether or not we would be able to force the Japanese into a bloodless surrender. So possession of those islands, there were a number of benefits. It put our naval forces right on the southern doorstep of the Japanese home islands. It provided a base from which we could raid their commerce and complete the work of cutting their supply lines to the southern resource territories, where in the southern part of your map there, their oil supply in particular in the East Indies. But it also, for our purposes today, established a set of airfields from which this relatively new, recently deployed B-29 Superfortress, a very heavy, very long-range bomber, would be able to make the round trip to hit Tokyo and the heavily industrialized region of the Kanto Plain, which is the area to the south and west of Tokyo, where most heavy industry and manufacturing and munitions were concentrated. And so the ability to bomb those regions directly introduced this new factor, which ultimately would be one of the major reasons that the Japanese faced up to the need to surrender.
And I just want to while we've got that map up, there had been this intention to bomb from China as well. And although it's a completely separate subject, we don't want to go down that rabbit hole. I think it's fairly safe to say that it hadn't been going particularly well, the operations from there. And certainly you can see by ranges there, you can't quite reach the main line anyway. But just if you want to kind of summarize why that hadn't been going particularly well, just before we move on to what we're talking about tonight, that would be quite cool.
Right, sure. Well, you mentioned the major issue, which was from the bases in China, which are deep in the interior. So Chengdu and Chongqing there were where the major B-29 bases were in China. And from there, they could hit southern Japan and the island of Kyushu. But they really couldn't get all the way to Tokyo. They did not have the range. You also had the problems of the security of those air bases against the rampaging Japanese armies in China. It was always a major concern whether or not the Chinese army and the Allied forces, which were there, would be able to repel a Japanese attack directly on those airfields. And then you had the terrible supply and logistics problems of getting fuel, bombs, ordnance, and supplies into that area. Most of them were being flown in from rear bases in India, and they were flown over the hump, over the Himalayas. And that was just a tremendously inefficient supply line. It was an airborne supply line, which really doesn't work. You need either a ground-based or a seaborne supply line to be able to have the heavy lift to bring in fuel and ordnance in a big way to support a major air campaign. And so for all of those reasons, the Marianas just made more sense as the principal base for the B-29 campaign. And as of January 1945, it was decided to essentially terminate those B-29 operations that were based in China and to move all of those aircraft to the Marianas.
And it's important to understand just how much logistics was being invested in the Marianas as well at this point. I mean, some of the things from your book, the takeaways, by in Guam, 200,000 American personnel there. Right. Pretty much every bullet, every drop of drinking water, every K-bar had come all the way 6,000 miles from the USA. So it's an enormous investment of men and material that the Allies have been putting into this. I mean, it was an enormous investment in terms of loss of life taking those islands in the first place, which is beyond the scope of today's show, of course. But now we have these airfields, and as you say, it now enables us to have this sea route to supply them. It's still a long way, but it's easier than going to the bases in China. So the talk about the kind of second half of 1944, as we start to establish these airfields in the islands there, how the bombing was proceeding and what was not working particularly well about it, because we were going for precision bombing at that time. That's mainly correct, isn't it?
Yes, that was the orthodoxy in the Army Air Forces. It had really extended back, 15, 20 years before the beginning of the Second World War. The Army Air Corps had really seen its mission in strategic bombing as to develop the technologies to allow for very precise, very accurate bombing from high altitudes, to be able to hit principally industries and strategic targets on the ground. And the Army Air Forces had some degree of success using precision bombing techniques over Germany. They had developed this Norden bomb site, which had been advertised as a war-win technology, something that was unique. The Americans had it, no one else did. It turned out for a variety of reasons that technology was not as effective, and it was in particular not as effective over Japan. There are a number of reasons for that. Japan was often socked in, especially during the winter months, so you had heavy cloud cover. You had a very strong jet stream over Japan, particularly at the high altitudes. The B-29s flew in at over 30,000 feet. And so bombing accuracy had really been terrible in the early raids. The first raid from the Marianas was on, I believe, November 24th, 1944, when 100 planes hit targets in Tokyo. And the bombs had all fallen widely of the mark. And that continued, by and large, right through January and February. There were some improvements, and yet the tactic really had been to try to go in and destroy the Japanese aircraft industry. And the idea was that if you can stop the production of planes, the Japanese will not then be able to intercept these bombing raids, and then you can sort of have your way with the rest of the industrial base of Japan in terms of strategic bombing. But in the first several months, one raid after another, the bombs would usually fall outside of the perimeter fences of these aircraft manufacturing facilities. And so, largely the result had not been what Washington had expected.
And that's even the raids that got to Japan. I mean, the abort rates were through the roof. 20% or so of raids being aborted just because of weather and this, that, and else. So you're only getting off 4 out of 5 times, and then when you get there, you miss. And again, remind people how far it is. I mean, it's like a 7-hour flight from the Marianas to Tokyo, isn't it? So, so if the mission fails and you've sent people there 7 hours there, 7 hours back, you can't fire them away again there the next day. You've got to let everybody recover. So it's not very efficient. This force they've got this force multiplier of hundreds of B-29s, all this investment in airfields, but the results aren't coming in there. And so things change, and they change particularly. Well, let's talk about the January 1945. Is in your book you refer to it as the deadliest month, because we haven't also acknowledged the fact that until the Allies take Iwo Jima, the Japanese are also bombing the airfields as well. So that's not helping either. So we want to run through a little bit about why you give January that particular label. That would be good, I think.
Sure. Well, January, the loss rate on aircraft that had flown bombing missions against Japan in that month from the Marianas was over 5%. So 5%, that's 1 out of 20 planes. And the airmen could do the math. That meant that if they flew 20 missions, statistically, they were likely to die. Their plane was likely to go down. Some of these aircraft were making controlled water landings at sea, generally after bombing Japan. But the air-sea rescue response was very poor at that point in the war, partly just because of the tremendous distances involved. Of getting the seaplanes, which were the kind of principal way that we rescued downed air crews, getting them to search over those enormous expanses of ocean, and their sort of fuel endurance limited their ability to kind of search in those areas that were very far north of any American held island. We got the submarines involved as a lifeguard league, and all of that improved gradually. But in January, which was the deadliest month, you were losing 1 out of 20 planes that did these missions. The average combat tour for the air crews was said to be 35, right? So you did 35 combat missions, and then you might have a chance of being rotated out of the theater. So, you can see what this does to morale. The air crews are looking at the situation and thinking, it's likely that we're all going to die. We're just going to keep flying missions until most likely our plane is going to go down. And it's very tough to kind of maintain morale under those kinds of circumstances. And so, January, for all of those reasons, was a particularly tough month for the B-29s.
Yeah, and we also, I want to reference the fact that in November 1944, we do reconnaissance of Japan, because one of the things, again, amazing about your book is the Allies really hadn't got any updated information about Japan since the Tokyo raid, the Doolittle raiders of years earlier, because of the distance again. So if the Allies are going to strike at Japan, and you talked about the aircraft factories and all these other key targets, we need updated information. So November is quite important in that regard to gaining this information. So they sent these photo reconnaissance aircraft out there to get information. Was there anything that particularly came back from those missions that was a game changer, that had changed in the previous 3 years? What are Japan's air defenses like, for example, at this point in the war?
Well, their air defenses were limited mainly in that they had no experience, essentially, of protecting, at least not of protecting Tokyo or that region of Japan. They had seen B-29 raids, as we discussed earlier, in Kyushu. They, also, encountered, when the B-29 started coming in, this issue of getting up to altitude. The reason the B-29 was a pretty good plane at avoiding interception was that it flew very high and it flew very fast. And most fighters of that era, particularly Japanese fighters, take them a long time to get to that altitude. At 30,000 feet, they were fairly sluggish. And if they had to climb even 1,000 feet more above 30,000 feet, they suffered a significant loss in their ground speed. So to get up to that height with the speed they needed to intercept was difficult. And that was really the best defense for the B-29s. The air reconnaissance, as you say, there was one flight in particular. I believe it was Ralph Stakely was the pilot, who was able to fly a specially configured B-29 camera plane and took a massive number, I believe thousands and thousands of aerial photographs on this one flight in conditions in November 1944 that were just, for whatever reason, sort of freakishly clear. And so that one flight produced just an enormous wealth of aerial photography that allowed the Army Air Force's target selectors to make a much more kind of careful study of what it is they wanted to bomb and where it was. And so yes, air reconnaissance in general, and that flight in particular, was very important in providing the data that our analysts needed to decide, where we were going to concentrate our efforts. So
then the Allies achieve the victory over Iwo Jima, and then that enables the construction of more airfields. So that's important. That then it does two things. It removes the threat of those Japanese bombers and attacking the airstrips you already have, but it also it adds more ability to the Air Force there to bring more B-29s in and strike in larger and larger numbers. But we have had this issue, as you said, about the precision bombing not working. We'll talk about the jet stream. The jet stream came up in the sidebar a couple of minutes ago. We'll talk about that over Japan as well. So you've got this force there. Precision bombing isn't working particularly well. January is a very bleak month, 45, with loss of aircraft. So if this force we've got here is going to be any good, there's going to be some kind of change there. And so there's this debate between precision bombing and an alternative option. And so what's the other alternative option? And who is the person who instigates or is the person behind this change of tactics?
Right. So we'll get into Lemay and the firebombing, but that's a photograph of Iwo Jima you've got up there.
Yeah.
Why don't we just speak briefly about Iwo Jima?
Sure. Yeah.
That was important. So taking the island of Iwo Jima was important both in a defensive sense and in an offensive sense. And the Army Air Force's generals were among those who were pushing for the capture of this island. It was important in a defensive sense because the Japanese were able to launch air attacks from Iwo Jima on the B-29 fields, particularly in Saipan, which is the northernmost of those islands, but even all the way down to Guam. And they would fly these very audacious raids, often just with fighters, flying low, hugging the surface of the ocean to kind of get in under the radar of the defensive radar on the Marianas, and then they would suddenly appear over these fields and essentially strafe the parked B-29s. This happened again and again. There were some very destructive raids. I believe in one raid, 11 B-29s were destroyed in this sort of an attack. The Brigadier General Haywood Hansel, who was the 21st Bomber Command commanding officer, had witnessed one of these attacks personally, where the pilot of a Zero had actually landed on the field after expending all of his aircraft's ammunition, had leapt out of his cockpit, and had started firing his pistol at American soldiers and was shot dead. So a series of these rather spectacular raids. So taking Iwo Jima would stop those attacks. At the same time, it would then provide the Americans with the ability that using those captured airfields on Iwo Jima, small island that's on the flight line from the Marianas to Tokyo, would allow the American fighter planes, the P-51s, to begin accompanying the B-29s and providing fighter escorts. And so that didn't occur until April. But in those last months of the war, that was important in essentially providing additional defenses against Japanese fighters that were coming in to intercept. So that was the story of Iwo Jima. We talked about Iwo Jima, you and I, in an earlier program.
Yep.
I think for those reasons, really, that we just went over, Iwo Jima is one of those islands when, it sometimes is debated, what islands might we have bypassed and saved a lot of American lives? Most analysts, and I agree, believe it was necessary for us to have Iwo Jima, and that it was even worth the tremendous cost of more than 6,000 Americans killed in action in that battle. If we had been able to do it differently, I think it would have been desirable to have taken Iwo Jima earlier. If we had taken it 5-6 months earlier, we might have been able to take it essentially in a sort of a walkover. But that's how the Battle of Iwo Jima touched on this bombing campaign.
Well, you made that point in the first show with me.
Yeah.
And you can see on the map there, it's almost halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo,
Right.
and in just we talking about the difficulty of the air sea rescue operations finding downed B-29s. By the time we achieve the liberation or the seizing of Iwo Jima, it's giving us that friendly base halfway on that bombing. It's another place in the ocean there that is going to help with the air sea rescue. So countless B-29 crews were potentially saved because of holding the iron there. So it's important. You can just see the geography of its location there is so very important. So, and Hansel, you mentioned Hansel, Brigadier General Hansel earlier, because he has been the proponent of the precision bombing, because this is something that he kind of truly believes in. And as you said, it's the standard doctrine that U.S. Army Air Forces is showing anyway. But Lemay comes in. We mentioned Curtis Lemay, and he's an important figure because there's this interesting power thing. It comes up so often on World War II TV where people from one level, where someone is senior to someone else, someone then overtakes them on the ladder. And that kind of what happens with Lemay. Lemay was in many ways the darling of the U.S. Army Air Force at this point. And he has now superseded Hansel, even though they were at an earlier point, a different level. So explain kind of their dynamic. It reminds me of the Bradley and Patton, those kind of standard relationships you end up getting a lot in World War II. So let's talk about, before we bring in Lemay, talk about the two of them.
Right. So Hansel, Hansel's 41, Lemay's 38 at this time. I just paused to take that in for a moment. The Army Air Corps was a very young service.
And here's Lemay.
Really all of these generals had come up, essentially started as pilots. Then they had been promoted to command squadrons, and then wings. And so they'd moved up the ranks, in many cases while continuing to fly combat missions. And when they reached a certain point, they were told they could no longer fly in combat because they knew too much. And if they were shot down over enemy territory, there would be a security risk. And all of them were bitterly disappointed when were told they had to stop flying. Lemay and Hansel both had protested this prohibition against flying, leading these missions themselves. So that was very much part of the culture. They were young men. They were still good pilots, excellent pilots. In fact, both of them were. So Lemay had, as you said, had been promoted over the head of Hansel. So he had been junior to Hansel at the beginning of the war, and then was promoted to major general. And he had been commanding the operations in China, in the India-China theater, which is where the 20th Bomber Command was. And when it was decided to essentially shut down that operation, it was decided that the 20th and 21st Bomber Commands would be merged and they would be co-located in the Marianas. So Lemay was to be reassigned to the Marianas. He being the senior general now, it was decided that Hansel would be sort of placed in a subordinate role as a second in command. Hansel decided that probably wasn't going to work well, so he requested to be recalled to the States, and Lemay comes in and takes over at the end of January 1945. And, The story, as it's often told, is that Hansel personally loved the kind of traditional idea of precision bombing, and that Lemay had this idea that instead you send the bombers in low and you send them in at night, and you just lay waste through essentially carpet bombing using incendiaries. Well, I think that story is echoed down through the decades. Really, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. This debate was occurring, I think it's fair to say, within the Army Air Forces, with among analysts in Washington, not just out in the Pacific. Should we continue to try to make this high altitude precision bombing in daylight work, or should we start experimenting with some of these other ways of doing things, mixing incendiaries into the bomb loads, and then eventually this very bold idea of going in at very low altitude at night and simply scattering these incendiaries over a large area, which is eventually what was done in March and in the great Tokyo firebombing raid,
which we'll talk about later, of course. So,
right.
but and you're right. It's interesting that Lemay has got the label of being the instigator, the creator, the proponent of the firebombing. Just like when we talked on yesterday's show with Tony Redding, Harris has the same reputation for Dresden and Pforzheim or what have you. And actually, as you make the point you made there, is that they're part of a larger school of people who are part of this tactical change. So, but Lemay is the one who is given all the credit for it.
And Lemay claimed it too. That's
he used it for his own. Yeah, for his own kind of. He was Lemay was very one of those in that sort of Patton MacArthur ilk.
Yes.
He liked his publicity. He liked the machine that was being created around. There's nothing wrong with that, but he was good at working the media. He's good at taking credit for things, and partly that's the reason why he's now got this label, because he wanted the label, I suppose.
Yeah, well, he did order the these tactics, and he did it without asking specifically for approval of the chain of command. He later said he did that because he wanted the Army to be able to pin the blame on him if it went wrong. There may be some truth in that. But the idea that Lemay had this idea that we should do it this way and that no one else had considered that is simply false. All of these possible tactics, including this low altitude nighttime kind of scattering incendiaries across a wide area, all of that had been intensively studied and debated throughout the Air Corps, including up in Washington and even at the joint level of the Joint Chiefs.
Yeah, and we'll talk about. I want to talk about it later as well, or maybe even now, about the reports done after the war with Japanese civilians about what their greatest fear was, because that's another thing I think is important to address. Is that this bombing of Japan, it has to have some kind of effect, otherwise there's no point doing it. So that's something again you talk about in your book. These studies, the Japanese, there's a couple of things going on there. One is because of the technology of their houses and Tokyo and lots of wood and things, and they'd had some pretty important fires in their history, going back several hundreds of years. So maybe the Japanese have a cultural increased fear of fire. And also they're under the same kind of regime as the Third Reich, where they're being given a very propaganda version of events and how the war's going. So I'm interested if you just would share a little bit about what you put in your book about what the Japanese were saying about their fear of bombing, because I think it's important to understand what their reaction was. Because when they first saw B-29s, they were quite excited by them. These aircraft thousands of feet up in the sky. But what was the results of these surveys?
Right. So as you say, the Japanese regime during the war really had essentially complete control over what the average Japanese citizen was allowed to know about what was happening in the war. And so there was this kind of total Orwellian control of information. And they had insisted on continuing to tell their people that they were winning this war. And the sort of massive deceit is a major theme in my trilogy. Of course, when you send a bombing raid over the country, there's no way to censor that out of existence, right? I mean, the ordinary people on the street can look up and see the bombers flying overhead. when the bombs fall and they start destructive fires, homes are destroyed. And so it really presented a dilemma for the regime that was still trying to sort of shape the way that their own people perceived what was happening. They could not pretend that these raids were not happening, and they essentially sort of vacillated between trying to, say that these are feeble and ineffective raids. We're shooting down, hundreds of these American bombers, and they're not doing any damage to our war effort. On the other hand, they wanted to try to arouse the Japanese to larger efforts, to give more to the war effort, to try to sort of stiffen their resolve. And so they would play up the civilian casualties and try to arouse popular anger as a result of that. But afterwards, when our surveyors went in after the war in occupied Japan and surveyed ordinary people, they discovered that the bombing raids, more than any other single factor, had really caused the Japanese to question the credibility of official reports and to begin to doubt that Japan really had the ability to win this war. And so in terms of morale, in terms of sort of sapping the Japanese people's willingness to go on, to continue fighting, the bombing raids were tremendously effective in that sense.
And I think that's where there's a slight difference with Germany, in that it seemed, generally speaking, with Goebbels and the propaganda machine there, that the more the Allies bombed Germany, in some ways, Goebbels was able to turn that back and direct the anger back at the Allies for doing the firebombing and the increased hatred of captured American and British aviators that were landing there. But in Japan, it seems that by contrast, the anger kind of goes towards their own government and their feeling of being misled, their feeling of being lied to. So it's interesting that if we talk about the concept of strategic bombing, that the reaction of the populations in Japan and Germany seems to be somewhat different at that point of the war, which I just think is worth commenting on, just because it's interesting.
Right. Yeah. It may have something to do with the history of Europe and the history of Japan. Japan being an isolated island country that had, never in its history had to deal with a foreign invasion before, and so the appearance of enemy warplanes in Japanese skies was something that tended to arouse this sort of panic, just because it was so completely outside their historical experience.
So when does Lemay arrive on Guam, and what does he find there? Because as we said earlier, there's thousands and thousands of American personnel there. Because essentially he's a bit annoyed at the kind of the lavish conditions that are there that he finds, and all this luxuries, and there are reports you talk about of you could get anything you wanted in the PXs there. You could get all these resources had got there, and so his reaction, he shook things up a bit when he arrived.
Yeah, so he took over at the end of January 1945, and as you say, the Marianas were to be this base for this immense bombing campaign that he was in charge of, but they were also to serve as a base for the buildup of American troop strength and as a launch pad for the invasion of Iwo Jima, then Okinawa, then the Japanese home islands. And so, there were tremendous numbers of troops. I believe there were about 200,000 American troops on Guam by the end of February 1945, if I remember correctly. Think about that. That's an enormous number. That's just on Guam, not counting Saipan and Tinian. So these islands were being very rapidly developed for multiple purposes. And Lemay took the view that we had taken the Marianas mainly because we wanted to use them as airfields for the B-29s. Nimitz and the admirals countered that we also were using these islands as a way to build up our strength for these tremendous amphibious invasions to come, and that it would necessarily involve trade-offs. The logistics, the scale of the logistics and construction effort was tremendous. The B-29 needed a runway almost 2 miles long to operate. We planned to operate 1,000 of these aircraft from the Marianas, and we did eventually. And so we needed, 8 to 10 of these enormous runways. And and you see there, those are the supporting hard stands. Those essentially were where the planes were parked, and the taxiways. And so you have to clear these enormous areas. You have to grade them. You then have to mine the coral rock in order to make all of that concrete. And before you can even really start construction on a major scale, you need a working island infrastructure. So you need roads, for example, linking the seaports and the coral pits to these airfield sites. You need the basic infrastructure of water, electrical power, sanitation, housing, all of these issues. And so the scale of the construction and the speed with which that was done was really just a thing. I think that's Northern Tinian.
Yeah, Tinian, yeah. And that's what's so different. A lot of people watching this are probably more familiar with the ETO and the 8th Air Force, and of course all the renewed interest because of Masters of the Air filming right now. And that you can just look at that photo there, the multiple runways and taxiways. That's the equivalent of about 5 or 6 conventional airfields in the UK, all in one place.
That's right.
All the resources there. And I think this is a good point to mention the fact that, because later on we're going to be talking about whether or not the firebombing of Tokyo was, a good thing or a bad thing. But the thing is, the American Army Air Force has invested, as have the Seabees and Navy, just billions into creating these airfields. They've billions into creating these aircraft. You've got to do something with them. You've got to. You've made this expenditure. You've got to use them now, and this is where Lemay comes in. I think we ought to talk about as well this incendiary bomb idea, and particularly the weapon that had been invented. I've got a bit of video I'm going to play people in a minute, but talk a little bit about the M69 Incendiary Bomb, because it really is a fascinating bit of technology we don't really have in the ETO. It's really a Pacific thing. Right.
Well, it's a napalm bomb, and for some reason that napalm, I think in sort of popular understanding, is much more closely associated with Vietnam. For some reason, like napalm became much more sort of notorious in the way that it was used in Vietnam, but it was used very widely in World War II as well. It was used by carrier planes, and these incendiaries were essentially it was napalm is a jellied gasoline. It's essentially gas treated with a gelatinous chemical. You see it there. It's being inserted into that cheesecloth, and then the cheesecloth is inserted into essentially kind of a pipe, and then the pipes are bound together in these large E-46 sort of fin bombs. You see them strike the ground there, and a fuse would detonate them and then shoot these kind of globules of this flaming napalm out where it would stick to anything it hit. So that is, I believe, the factory where most of these things were made was in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, about 15 miles inland from Atlantic City, in a very secretive plant. A plant, by the way, was demolished, but if you go, you can actually go drive and find it. I haven't done it yet, but I've seen pictures where there's a sort of a spooky ruin, almost like a Roman ruin out in the middle of the Pine Barrens in southern New Jersey, where these things were built. So the idea was that you would drop them over a wide area. You didn't need to aim them really at anything. You just needed to drop them in a densely populated city, and they would start thousands of fires in different locations, making it impossible for the firefighting teams to respond, because you had a number of fires that would then sort of merge into one enormous fire, particularly on a windy night. And then you get a firestorm, and you get the kind of, tremendous devastation that we saw in Tokyo in March, and also in Dresden just 3 weeks earlier.
And these, they burn at 1,000 degrees centigrade or something for 10 minutes. And so if it arrives into a building, it's going to make that building catch fire. And we saw the results in that film of one aircraft dropping a cluster of these things. And this is upwards of 300 B-29s coming over. So the potential devastation is just, off the charts. It's amazing. I want to talk a bit about the tactical, well, the weather advantage of low level, because Lemay wanted to do this at sort of 5,000 to 7,000 feet. Now, what was the rationale behind that?
Well, there were a number of advantages of going in low. One was simply that you didn't have to burn as much fuel in order to get your planes up to altitude. By not having to burn as much fuel, you could carry a much larger bomb load. And so on those firebombing missions, the individual planes were carrying, I believe, 6 to 7 tons of incendiary bombs, whereas in the high altitude missions, the average had been something more like 3. And so 3 tons, that is. So that's one advantage. Secondly, at the low altitudes, you don't have the jet stream. And so, the sort of correcting for ballistics errors and navigational errors associated with those high altitude missions wouldn't be as much of an issue. The idea was to go in at night, which really had never been done before. You would not necessarily have to aim. You essentially would send your planes over flying, evenly spaced at those low altitudes, and tell them to essentially pull the string, drop the bombs when they had reached a certain point in their flight. So they really weren't aiming at anything. We were just sending several hundred bombers in at low altitude, and with the intention of scattering these incendiary clusters across a wide area of the city.
But it was a risk, because although you're at the low altitude, so avoiding the jet stream, there were some predictions that this would be devastating because of the response of Japanese fighters to this, because they're lower, and you said earlier how about that, if they're 30,000 feet, the Japanese fighters couldn't get up that quick enough to do it. Right. But if you're going at 7,000 feet, it's a very different prospect. So although Lemay was keen to implement this idea, it wasn't. There were people who didn't agree with it. So. Nevertheless, he does it anyway. But so we're talking about Operation Meetinghouse, which is the destruction of Tokyo. So we're talking about March 1945. So talk a little bit about how the raid was planned. Well, you have done already, but we're talking of, I think it's is it 334 B-29s for the first mission?
Yep, that sounds like the right number.
So and again, you're saying that later on we had 1,000 bombers there. So it's still small in some scales, but we're talking about this raid on Tokyo with the idea, as you say, of not trying to hitting a wider area. So how did they sell that idea to kind of the press at the time? Were the press, the people behind it, because this is coming at the same time of in the war of the beginning of the bombing of Germany, and there's already questions being raised about this. So, did Lemay have to kind of fight for this?
Well, he ordered the mission without consulting higher ups, as I mentioned before. Yeah. The signals coming from Washington had been pretty clear that Hap Arnold and the Army Air Forces and the Joint Chiefs were willing to experiment with the use of incendiaries, and willing to experiment with different tactics if that could get the job done. There were the moral and ethical questions, as you mentioned. Dresden had occurred, I believe, just 3 weeks before the first big bombing over Tokyo, and after Dresden, there had been some question as to whether or not the Allies would acknowledge that they had essentially adopted terror bombing as a tactic to try to force the Germans to surrender. I think both the Americans and the British government at first were reluctant to acknowledge that publicly, although that clearly is what the shift that had been made. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, for example, told the press that the firebombing of Dresden had not been an act of terror bombing, but that they had been targeting munitions plants and railroad hubs in Dresden. And then even after the firebombing of Tokyo, Stimson was asking questions internally as to whether or not this kind of a tactic could be justified or not. Of course, by that time, I think the mood, both among the Allied people broadly and the Allied leadership, was we need to get this war over with, and we're willing to use sort of ruthless tactics to do so, things that we would not have even considered doing prior to the war.
This is what comes. Sorry to interrupt. This is what came up with Tony Redding last night. Is that we now look at the timeline of World War II and we see how close the end of the war was now to these events, and so that that means we can now question: was it necessary? Was this? But at the time, of course, think of the, as you said earlier, the loss of life to take Iwo Jima, the loss of life the Americans have been enduring in the island hopping and the naval battles out there, the losses of the air crews in Europe, the losses around the world. There's a desire now to bring this war to an end. Don't slacken off the gas now. And if anything, put your foot down and see this war out and bring this horror to an end. So I think we have to judge it from the time it was happening and not always look at it with the benefit of knowing how things evolved in that as the summer went on. So, you're absolutely right. It was Dresden had just happened and there was already raising questions. But it's interesting in the sidebar on YouTube, people are questioning we're calling this strategic bombing. Is that a fair word to describe what eventually becomes the leveling of a city? And these are questions. Everybody's got an opinion. There's no definitive answer as such. But obviously you've written about this, and when you read about the raid, and we'll talk about some of the civilian accounts and things. You do talk about the Japanese on the ground. You do talk about their reaction there. Just as going off on a slight tangent, before you tackled your trilogy. Did you have preconceived ideas about the bombing of Tokyo that would change when you did your research? Did your research just confirm what you already believed? I'm just intrigued what process you went through during the writing.
Are we talking about the moral and ethical dimension?
Yeah, well, the whole thing, really. I mean, what did you when you went to school? What did you learn about the bombing of Japan, for example? And did your research actually change what you thought you knew?
Well, I think the first description I read of the firebombing of Tokyo was probably in John Toland's book, The Rising Sun, which was sort of enormous 1,000-page epic history of the entire story of Japan through the 1930s, through the war. I also happened to live in Tokyo when I was a kid, between the ages of 11 and 14. I lived in a neighborhood that was wiped out by the firebombing. I didn't know that until later. And so, for me, I've always thought of Tokyo as being, almost like a second home. I lived there in those very formative years, and I'm affectionate toward the place. And so, of course, that's going to influence the way I think about it. But, in general, I would say that I was aware of the firebombing of Tokyo early in my life and my career before I started seriously researching the Second World War. And so for me, the research has sort of filled in the gaps rather than shocked me. Before we got off on a tangent there, we were talking about this revolutionary new tactic, sending the B-29s in at 5,000 to 7,000 feet. Well, they'd gone in at 27,000 to 30,000 feet. So that's a tremendous difference, right? I mean, you're not just going in at a slightly lower altitude, you're going in 4 or 5 miles closer to the ground than you had on previous missions. And there's the threat of Japanese fighters. There's also Japanese anti-aircraft guns on the ground, which generally had not been able to reach the high-flying B-29s with any sort of effectiveness. And so there was concern that these planes would be cut to ribbons just by the anti-aircraft fire, particularly in Tokyo, where there were more anti-aircraft batteries defending that city than anywhere else in Japan. And so when this tactic was announced for security reasons, the air crews and pilots were not briefed until the night before the mission. There were sort of audible gasps in the briefing room when these air crews were told that they were going to be going in at night in altitudes as low as 5,000 feet above the city. And many of them were very pessimistic. Many of them thought that perhaps a third of the planes would be lost on this mission. And there was a tremendous concern until it happened and was, really, I would say, in operational terms, an extraordinary success.
And you've answered the question the Great Dominion had there about how well trained and prepared the pilots were for night operations at low level. Basically, you were saying they weren't, which is interesting in of itself. That they changed the ideas. And there's no time, and for security reasons, to even practice this new technique. But as you say, the operation is set for March 9th and 10th, 1945. And the thing that I think was the most fascinating rereading your book again is when these. And it seems to be very haphazardly organized. This isn't the kind of tight box formations you get in the ETO. It's a bit different. But the thing that was incredible is when they reach Tokyo and they start dropping these incendiaries, is the effect of the updraft. So talk a little bit about the updraft, what it was and how it affected the aircraft, because that's, I guess, one of the things a scientist couldn't have probably predicted. They've understood what these incendiary bombs do, because we saw that footage where they practiced with them and things, but no one could possibly have understood how that quantity, what effect that was going to have on a city like Tokyo until they actually do it. So talk about, as these aircraft come over, the updraft and what some of the air crews experienced.
Right. So particularly the planes that came in later, they weren't flying in formation. They were essentially just flying an assigned altitude and heading, each aircraft. And they were to fly to Tokyo Bay and then to turn onto a northerly heading and then travel for a certain distance and then drop. So they weren't actually aiming at anything, as I said before.
Yeah.
By the time the later planes came in, you had more than 10 square miles of Tokyo, essentially just a raging inferno, and they're a little over a mile above this tremendous fire. And so the heat was creating these extraordinary updrafts. And so as these aircraft flew, over the burning part of Tokyo, they suddenly began ascending, essentially, as if a giant balloon had been attached, a hot air balloon had been attached to each plane. And, the pilots knew that, in order to hold their planes down to their assigned altitude, they essentially would have to dive into this updraft. And in order to do that, they would probably, subject the planes to so much pressure that they would come apart. So instead, essentially, they just had to let the updraft take them. And many of them reported ascending as much as 8,000 to 10,000 feet before they kind of got up on top of this updraft area. And so, they're being thrown around, just an extraordinary turbulence. Remarkably, not many planes were destroyed in that. I think the loss rate for that mission was less than 5%. And of course, the result on the ground was, like a fifth of the city wiped out in one night.
Yeah, and I mean, these are the photos, and you can readily find these online, folks. And there's lots of stuff. The Pathé footage you can look on YouTube there. I mean, the devastation there was absolutely horrendous. And it's interesting when you're searching, by the way, folks, on Google, you'll find that sometimes images for Hiroshima and Nagasaki come up when you're looking for Tokyo, and it's difficult to kind of ascertain what is what. And a lot of the photos were taken months and months later, so it's some of this damage isn't necessarily representative of what it was like the next day. But rather like with Tony Redding yesterday on our show, and he was talking about some of the German accounts. You do in your book explain some of the reaction of the Japanese there and the horror. I mean, they were diving into the river and all sorts of things there. I mean, regardless of what we may or may not think about the methodology of strategic bombing, you'd have to have a heart of stone not to feel some empathy for what these poor Japanese people were experiencing on the ground there. And I suppose you said, I didn't know you'd lived in Tokyo. For those poor people, it was just hell on earth that night.
Well, yes, it was, and no one knows how many died either. The statistic that is most often heard is 100,000. That's sort of a suspiciously round figure, isn't it?
Yeah.
And these neighborhoods were so thoroughly destroyed that not only were the homes destroyed, but the government administrative offices that included whatever records may have existed concerning who lived where, those are all wiped out as well. So there was kind of a wholesale loss of records. There were, questions as to how many people were living in those neighborhoods because there had been a flood of people out of the cities, and they, the authorities sort of despaired of making an accurate body count after the war, and so 100,000 may be true. Some have argued that the toll may have been closer to 200,000. I think the official government. The Japanese government estimate is something like 104,000.
But the data I found today, I mean, things are changing all the time. I got this graph today saying 140,000 is a figure that's being said today, which is not quite. It's more than Hiroshima or Nagasaki separately, and nearly the same Tokyo as those two atomic bombs together. Nearly.
Right.
But when as you said, and it was, according to your book, it was 14 aircraft lost of the 334 that flew that first raid there. So the worries about the Japanese fighter response were in the end proved to not be a problem.
The Japanese fighters were unable to respond effectively for the same reason we just discussed. That thermal updraft essentially made it impossible for them to control their planes, and the anti-aircraft fire was sort of wild and ineffective. And so it was an effective use of surprise. The Japanese had not expected this kind of attack. So, for all of those reasons, I think the most surprising thing to the Americans was how few planes they had lost. And of course, that came as a very pleasant surprise from the American point of view.
And so it's difficult, given the records lost, given that they don't have an idea of a civilian death toll. Is it possible, with the benefit of 76 years of hindsight, to understand or put a figure on what effect this had on both Japanese industry and Japanese transport? And was there a military success to this raid beyond the shock to the Japanese people?
Well, yeah. So we didn't get into it, but going back to the kind of question of how the American and Allied governments wanted to discuss these new tactics they were using both in Germany and in Japan, there was a reluctance to acknowledge that we were just going to use terror bombing, that we were just going to target civilian populations, and as a way of sort of forcing the Axis nations to acknowledge that they had been totally defeated. And so the pretense that was chosen to describe these raids at first by the Americans was to argue that in the neighborhoods that we had burned down, there had been a number of these small feeder or supply sort of shops, small factories, which were producing components for the Japanese war industries, and that it was impossible to target these smaller shops individually. So you just had to burn the entire neighborhoods down. So, but that was the real target. That's the story we told the press. That really wasn't true at all. The neighborhoods that were targeted in Tokyo were targeted really for the simple reason that we estimated that they would burn the best of any other part of Tokyo. The Sumida River Basin, which was the neighborhoods that were targeted, were where the building density was highest. Our analysts, including the OSS, the predecessor agency to the CIA, had collected data from pre-war sources, which included some of the fire insurance assessments made by Japanese insurance companies. And so we were essentially looking for a way to burn down as many buildings as possible, and presumably to kill as many Japanese as possible in these raids. And that was the real purpose of the incendiary bombing campaign. I think it's clear.
And obviously, well, not obviously, if there was any question at a higher level about the appropriateness of this raid, the fact is they carried on, didn't they? I mean, Lemay wanted to almost go back the next day. And of course, with the long flight times and everything else, it didn't happen. But it carried on. We did Osaka and other Japanese cities.
Yeah, I think we did five more major incendiary raids in the following 10 or 11 days. And that first week of firebombing, where we hit Osaka, we hit Nagoya, Kobe, then Tokyo again. The only reason we stopped after that 10 days, that 10-day blitz, was that literally the entire stock of incendiary munitions in the Marianas had been used in these missions. So the warehouses were empty.
Yeah.
We had no more of those incendiary weapons. And then Nimitz had to then order essentially all-out shipping effort to replenish those supplies, and then the incendiary campaign didn't begin again until April, almost a month later.
And then, of course, we get into the summer of 45. We get into the atomic bomb use, which is another subject for another day, and I may or may not be doing something on that in August. We'll see how it goes. But we're getting towards the end of the show now, and you've written a trilogy. You've done interviews. You've spoken about this before, and I was asked by a couple of people today, are we going to mention the Malcolm Gladwell Bomber Mafia book? And it hasn't come up naturally. But the thing is, there is always this examination. I mean, the show I did yesterday about Pforzheim, which wasn't about Dresden. Dresden came up in the sidebar, and it's fair to say there were people on both sides of the argument debating each other very politely. I have to say there was no hostility on there. But, within the you're American historian. You deal with other American historians. Where do you think Lemay and these bombing missions sit now? Have we accepted it? Is it still something we debate? What's the legacy of it?
Well, I would say in general that the firebombing raids are not as controversial among Americans as the atomic bombs are, and I think there are probably a few reasons for that. The atomic bombs were right at the end of the war. The nuclear weapon was something new, unprecedented. When you drop one of those, when you firebomb a city, even people right in the middle of the city might survive. There's a chance, right? If you're near the epicenter of a nuclear strike, you're gone, no matter what, right? Firebombing will kill 100,000 people, but once it's over, generally those who survived are not going to become sick and die. With the atomic weapons, you have this kind of lingering effect of people who survive might die afterwards. So for all of those reasons, it's a different category. I would say, in general, given the specific circumstances of the Pacific War, the fact that the Japanese started it, the behavior of Japanese troops overseas, of their military forces, their behavior against civilians in China, the rape of Manila, the sack of Manila, which was one of the darkest chapters of the Pacific War, comparable to the rape of Nanking. That happened just 2 weeks before the first big firebombing of Tokyo. I mean, clearly these events are linked, I think.
Yeah, and I was saying, ask what the Australians think about this. From their people in Changi and the British and the prisoners of war who were taken in Singapore. It's there's lots of complex things to discuss here. A couple of questions coming in on the sidebar. There is one is what type of, you said the incendiary raids couldn't start again until April. Did they continue, or was it a mixture of other types of bombs being dropped then, or was it? As we go into April, May and June, what was going on?
It was a mixture. So the B-29s then were continuing with this sort of pinpoint precision bombing strikes. They were called into service to support the Okinawa campaign by bombing Kyushu airfields to try to suppress the kamikaze response to our invasion of Okinawa. They began increasingly using radar bombing, and that became much more effective to the point where you had specially trained, B-29 units equipped with the latest radars that could go in at high altitude, and even if there was a complete cloud cover and they couldn't see the ground at all, they could hit targets accurately from altitude with radar bombing. And so the progress, Hansel, who had, wanted to continue the precision bombing to refine it, and had said, we're going to get better at this. That view was vindicated to some extent, because by May, June, July, certainly by the end of the war, we were able to use high altitude precision bombing techniques and to hit the targets, and we were doing that. We continued to conduct incendiary raids. I think we had something like 60 different Japanese cities with incendiary raids. So it was a mix of different tactics. There was also the use of B-29s for laying mines in Japanese harbors and inland waterways, something called Operation Starvation. That ended up being one of the most effective single uses of the B-29s beginning in April. We mined the inland sea and essentially sort of continued or completed the work of essentially sort of cutting Japan's sea links by hitting waters that our submarines were not able to penetrate into. So by the end of the war, we were, I think the largest raid of the war was maybe August 3rd, I believe, where more than 800 B-29s lifted off on one day from Marianas airfields. And there were incendiary raids, there were precision bombing, radar targeting raids, and there were mine laying missions, all done on that same day.
And I think, just to go back to what you said a couple minutes ago, I think, from my point, another reason the atomic bombs are talked about more is because that was the beginning of a new era, whereas the firebombing was, in a sense, the end of the previous era, and it echoed heralded the beginning of the Cold War. And I still tell my stepkids that when I was going to school in the 80s, we had our, going under our desk drills because of nuclear war, and those type of things that seem weird to look back on now. But I'm 52 years old. That's something I remember in my childhood. So that started a new era that arguably we haven't even left yet. But and Lemay, of course, goes on to more things that are worth discussing. I mean, for another day, but the Cuban Missile Crisis is there with Kennedy and involved in all those things as well. So he had various things in his life that are possible to debate.
Yes, that's right.
And so, where do you think his legacy is? I mean, I like in the fact in your book you don't particularly get drawn into the what you think about MacArthur and some of these figures, but kind of what do you feel about Lemay? With as a writer, as a human being.
Well, I think in military terms, he was an effective commander. He was ruthless. He, I think reveled somewhat in his reputation for being completely ruthless. He's particularly well remembered by Americans for the reasons you say. He was a very young man in World War II. And he was still there 20 years later during the Vietnam era, and played an important role in directing our even larger bombing campaign we had against Vietnam and Cambodia during that era. So he is, I think if you count up all of the casualties in the campaigns in which he was directly involved in, you quickly get to the point where, strictly in statistical terms, you're looking at one of the most prolific killers in human history. And I don't think he shrunk from acknowledging that legacy. He saw it all as part of his duty as a military air commander. But for that reason, he will always be a controversial figure and someone that will, be used to sort of personify the use of U.S. air power in, a number of major conflicts in the 20th century.
And we discussed, you and I, in email before today about the Malcolm Gladwell book, and Gladwell. For those, I haven't read it and you haven't read it, but some of my friends have. Gladwell is, he actually says that Bomber Harris is a psychopath. He actually says those words in his book. He doesn't go that far with Lemay. He doesn't agree with Lemay, some of Lemay's ideas, but what he does seem to concede about Lemay is Lemay did care about his men. Lemay, and that's not that I'm not saying that Bomber Harris didn't care about his men, but he definitely makes the point, Gladwell, that Lemay does care about his men. He does care about his own bomb group's losses. So that is interesting that he comes out of this bomber mafia book with some grudging respect from an author who he's not ashamed to have a go at Bomber Harris. It's an interesting dynamic. I will read the book, and it is selling like absolute hotcakes. I've read some terrible reviews of it, but it's going to bring up these debates. That's the problem. It's going to, well, not the problem. That is the good thing in some ways. It will encourage debate about these subjects, and hopefully more people like yourself will get involved in these conversations, because I think it should be proper aviation and war historians who are commenting about these subjects, and not necessarily people who don't understand the greater picture about strategic bombing. But that's another subject for another day. But in terms of the what we've discussed tonight, I think we've done everything we're supposed to do on my list there. Again, folks, I will absolutely recommend, if you haven't already, some people have already said they've read it. The trilogy is an incredible read. It's a big one, but you rattle through it really, really quickly. I really enjoyed it, and it put a lot of pieces together that I wanted to know about the Pacific campaign, which is not my strongest area. But right now, folks, it remains for me to say thank you very much to Ian Toll for joining us. I think people have enjoyed it tonight. It's a hard subject. Talking about that civilian death is, it's a difficult thing to talk about and accept, but it happened, and it's part of the war, and we've talked about it. So when I do another show about the Pacific or something, if it's something else you'd like to come on and talk about, I'd be very grateful if you come back again, because I enjoyed talking to you. And have you enjoyed it?
Absolutely, I have. It's been a great talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So, folks, I'll just come back and say goodbye to you in a second, Ian, but I'll just remind our folks what we've got coming up. So, folks, this is the end of Strategic Bombing Week. There's a one-off show tomorrow night about the Women's Land Army, so a slightly softer subject tomorrow night compared to the firebombing of Tokyo. And then Monday, we begin our build-up to D-Day week. So we're talking about bombing of radar. We're talking about Mi-9, various shows coming up next week. And then, of course, we're into the June the 6th period, and there's lots of live streams coming to you from battlefields, which I'm looking forward to. As much as I enjoy doing these kind of studio-bound shows, I will be looking forward to getting out on the battlefields with cameras in Normandy, showing you some of the ground as they are today. So that's coming up soon. So, Ian, thank you very much for joining us, and thanks for everybody for watching. Again, check out the links to Ian's book below and Ian's website, and I will see you all tomorrow night for the Women's Land Army. Thank you very much, everybody.